Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we are reading the book entitled Pioneers Together by Josephine Cunnington Edwards. This book is a biography of Roy F. Cottrell and his wife Myrtie, who both were born in 1878 and led an exciting life of service and mission in the early days of the young and rapidly growing Seventh-day Adventist Church. In our last reading, we covered chapters 15 and 16, where Roy attended by invitation an annual gathering of 400 Protestant missionaries to China. During the event, one minister arose and protested the presence of the Adventists, declaring that they should not be allowed to agitate and disturb the minds of the simple Chinese Christian believers. Considerable turmoil followed, with many shouting in favor of the speaker and hostile glances toward Roy. After quiet was restored, Roy felt compelled to answer and spoke calmly but passionately, both about some of the truths of the gospel that were not addressed by many of the missionaries present, and of the SDA lack of agreement to restrict some missions to geographical locations. Although the storm really broke after he sat down, his words did not fall on deaf ears. For at the conclusion of the event, the chairman spoke passionately about the character and willingness of the Cottrells to help missionaries of other denominations, and quoted several examples of their kind-heartedness. He also proposed that no word of disfavor or criticism of the Adventist mission should be included in their report, and this was accepted. Later on, Myrtie was invited to act as a nurse for the highest-ranking Englishwoman in China, one Mrs. Cross, who was the daughter of a British nobleman and a maid of honor to Queen Victoria. The relationship ended up in a beautiful friendship, from which the Cottrells and their mission profited abundantly. Many events followed, including the outbreak of World War I, at about the time that A.G. Daniels, the General Conference President, was scheduled to visit the mission in China. When he finally did arrive, Roy went to meet him, and after a series of meetings in all the provinces of the conference, his month-long visit brought great inspiration to all the missionaries. At this time, Roy and Myrtie had served 7 years in China and were sent home on furlough, where they were greeted in San Francisco by the Farnsworths and learned that Ellen White had just been buried after completing decades of service and inspiration to the church. Her son, Elder White, invited the Cottrells to spend their time at Elmshaven, the former home of Mrs. White, and to join him in a literary endeavor to produce a compilation of her work regarding the work of foreign missionaries. In addition to this, Roy was invited by the General Conference to visit training schools, attend Union Conference sessions, camp meetings, and churches, where he spoke in over 50 places and interviewed many candidates for overseas service. Soon their furlough was over, and with 42 missionaries, set sail once again for China on a most adventurous voyage, which included a stopover in Honolulu and a terrific storm which damaged their ship and forced them to spend 4 days in Yokohama, Japan, for repairs. We pick up the story today with chapter 17, entitled Witnessing in Sundry Lands. On the flat, lush delta of the muddy Yangtze River stands Shanghai, Queen City of the East China coast. Reams have been written about this metropolis, for among its millions in population may be found those of almost every race and type of human beings, who walk the earth. Such a frightful mixture of good and evil. Many globetrotters have asserted that Shanghai, Johannesburg, Cape Town, San Francisco, New York, and Buenos Aires are the wickedest cities on the face of our planet. There were mission workers, literature evangelists, Catholic sisters, gamblers, gunmen, vice rings, opium dens, rum runners, disorderly houses, lavish wealth, palatial mansions, majestic avenues, beautiful parks, modern hotels, gilded theaters, together with the direst of poverty, mat sheds for homes, ragged beggars, lepers with running sores lay on the muddy streets. Countless other diseases fasten themselves on wretched human beings. And in certain native sections, no sanitary arrangements existed. Such was Shanghai a half-century ago. Outside and to the west of this sprawling seaport, with its teeming millions, lies a rich alluvial plain of nearly 50,000 square miles. This fertile area produces an abundance of rice, tea, silk, and many kinds of fruit and vegetables, most of which find their way to the overflowing markets of Shanghai. A few months after the SS China had discharged her passengers, Roy and Murty were called from their post of labor to a general meeting in this great city. The Asiatic Division, as it was then organized, embraced India, Burma, Australasia, and the various populous countries of the Far East. At this meeting, Roy was chosen as ministerial secretary of the division, and Murty was invited to lead out in the Sabbath school department. After working so many years in China, these devoted missionaries were invited to share their experience in a series of institutes, the first of which was to be held in Japan. The entire area of the Japan Island Group is but little more than that of the British Isles. Yet, it must support many teeming millions of people. For this reason, every available foot of fertile soil has been most carefully cultivated. Rice paddies and patches of vegetables crowded together. The landscape looks like a vast tufted patchwork quilt, with very shaded green blocks predominating. From the northernmost island, Hokkaido, to the southernmost tip of Kyushu, there are lakes, waterfalls, mountains, forests, hot springs, geysers, and beaches. In the ocean around Japan are sheltered areas where pearls are cultivated, and native women as well as men may be seen diving to the bottom to gather them. But Roy and Murty were there to help in gathering pearls more precious than these. Murty and Roy were charmed by the clean, beautiful cities of Japan, some of which date from the most ancient times. The city of Kyoto was actually the capital of Japan from the 8th to the 19th centuries. A tourist may still wander down the centuries-old streets and visit the magnificent shrines. High up in the mountains of Japan lies the celebrated religious center Nikko. These famous shrines were erected to glorify the Shinto religion, which was originally a form of nature worship. The priests of ancient Shintoism teach, as Christians do, that the world began by creation and by the peopling of the earth. But there, all similarities end, for their account of creation is very little like the biblical record. The Japanese have hundreds of deities, gods of trees, rocks, mountains, animals, ancestors, earth, sea, fire, and wood. Yes, even such necessities as a teacup, a stew pot, a bathroom, and a well of water are believed to have their own gods. Unlacing his shoes to enter the shrines, Roy was reminded of the scene in old Arabia by the burning bush when a voice spoke to Moses, "Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." In the most celebrated of the Nikko temples, they were shown a holy place. Amazingly, there were three principal articles of furniture: a golden candlestick, an altar of incense, and a golden cherry tree. Through a slight opening between two curtains, they were able to catch a glimpse of the most holy place. Here, the emperor alone came twice each year to make oblation for his people. This particular shrine has exquisite needlework on the hangings and curtains, a vivid reminder of the finely embroidered hangings of the tabernacle in the wilderness. Certainly, there must be a connecting link in the dim and distant past. This can be no other than a pagan replica of the tabernacle and rituals instituted 3.5 millenniums ago by Moses as directed by God. The Workers' Institute, which had brought Roy and Murty to Japan, was held at the mission headquarters in Tokyo. Both foreigners and Japanese entered into the carefully arranged programs with zest and enthusiasm. Much valued instruction was given, and the 10 days were well spent. On their way to the next institute, the Cottrells spent 2 days with the Alfonso Andersons in the quaint city of Hiroshima, 29 years later to become world-famed as the target for the first devastating atomic bomb, which brought an end to World War II. In the intervening years, Hiroshima had been transformed into a busy commercial seaport and industrial center. It is located on the northern shore of the inland sea and was built on several parts of a river delta between high hills. The atom bomb, in a matter of a few seconds, snuffed out 80,000 lives, maimed an equal number, and completely destroyed more than 4 square miles of the center of this teeming city. While Murty and Roy were in Hiroshima, they dined in Japanese style at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Tatsuguchi. This Christian gentleman, a prosperous dentist, had generously contributed to the erection of a beautiful little Seventh-day Adventist church near his home. His son at that time was a bright lad of 6 years. Later, he graduated as a physician from the Loma Linda University at Loma Linda, California. This talented young doctor lost his life with the Japanese forces in the Aleutian Islands during World War II. With the Andersons, the Cottrells climbed to the top of sacred Mount Miyajima. It was an ideal November day. and the trees were clothed in their gayest autumn attire. Along the upward trail were many unique little shrines and tea houses. When they reached the summit, the sights that greeted them were never to be forgotten. On one side, by the aid of strong field glasses, they were able to look down upon a little island where German prisoners of World War I were being interned. On the other side was the picturesque Japan Inland Sea, dotted with rocky isles and swarming with native ships and fishing craft. All of this, together with the multicolored autumn forests that were mirrored in the silvery waters, gave the mountain climbers the view of a lifetime. The next 3 weeks were spent in Korea, which at that time was under the iron heel of Japanese imperialism. This was a galling and bitter experience to the Koreans. Nevertheless, the Japanese inaugurated many improvements and did much to develop the natural resources of the country. They opened many mines during their occupation and found gold, iron, and valuable deposits of coal, copper, silver, and other minerals. They forbade the Koreans to burn the timber from the land, and many of the depleted forests were replanted. Dams and hydroelectric plants were built to furnish electric power for homes and industries. These irrigation projects turned many dry regions into fertile and productive farms. What had once been wasteland began to blossom as a rose. Yet, much of the riches gathered were appropriated by the island kingdom, and the unhappy Koreans chafed under the yoke. They were a people oppressed. In this land of the morning calm, 2 ministerial and Sabbath school institutes were conducted, the principal one at a place called Sunan. This was the early center of the Seventh-day Adventist mission work in that country. Here, our training school was located, and here, in a clinic so crude and primitive that it had cost only $20, Dr. Riley Russell had in 1 year treated 20,000 patients. Many churches and companies were located in that vicinity. But now this area is behind the bamboo curtain, and only God knows what is happening and how many brave souls are faithful even to imprisonment and death. At the port city of Shimonoseki, Roy and Murty boarded a Pacific liner for the Philippine Islands. For several hours during one dismal rainy afternoon, they skirted the coast of Taiwan, or Formosa, as it was known in the Western world. At that time, it was under Japanese rule, and no Christian missionary work was permitted. But today, it is the small stronghold of the brave men who represented free China as against the vast, seething mainland communism. Missionary work in the island is now encouraged and prospering. At noon on the following day, the ship steamed past the rocky bastion of Corregidor into fabulous Manila Bay. This was the scene of the historic naval battle of the Spanish-American War, when Admiral Dewey destroyed the ships of the enemy fleet. After all the intervening years, the mastheads of some of the sunken vessels could still be seen above the surface of the water. They were grim reminders of man's foolish way of settling international problems, a way that has never led to peace on earth and never will. As they neared port, a small boat brought the American pilot who came aboard and was greeted by the Japanese captain. For some unexplainable reason, these men did not coordinate. At any rate, even upon reaching the dock, the speed of the liner did not slacken. As it glided past its berth, passengers and crew members were much alarmed. The whole ship shivered as it crashed through the stone jetty and plowed into the mud bank beyond. This cushioned the shock somewhat, and the damage was negligible, though several people were thrown to the floor and a number of dishes broken. This was the maiden voyage of the SS President Cleveland under a Japanese captain. Someone facetiously remarked, he evidently supposed he could sail the ship right up Main Street. The 3-day ocean trip, sailing due southward, had brought the travelers from the winter cold of Korea to the summer heat of the Philippines. The rickshaws of the cities in China, Korea, and Japan were also left behind. In their place were horse-drawn, covered, two-wheeled, two-passenger carts. At nearly every intersection, these typical modes of conveyance awaited fears. At the time of this visit to the Philippines, the work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church had been established hardly more than a decade. Yet, so rapidly had it grown that there were already a number of prosperous churches, numerous companies, a well-conducted training school, and a publishing house that was self-supporting. It was gratifying to conduct a Sabbath school and ministerial institute with such an intelligent and aggressive core of foreign and native workers. Among them were Bibiano Panis and Emilio Manalesai, both of whom spoke fluent English. Language interpreters are oftentimes mentioned jokingly as interrupters, but these young men translated so rapidly that the speakers must be constantly on the alert to keep up with their interpreters. Over the weekend, the Cottrells visited a newly established church located among the coconut groves of San Pablo, some 50 miles from Manila. They were courteously entertained in the home of a native shopkeeper who accompanied them to the little church in the suburbs of the town. The small, picturesque sanctuary had a thatched roof and loosely thatched sidewalls to admit both light and air. It was beautifully rustic and blended with nature, as does the out of doors. The seating capacity was about 150, and on this occasion of the visit, it was overflowing. The visitors were much pleased with the order in which the Sabbath school and church services were conducted, observing the time-honored pattern. It was hard to believe that they were in the heart of a sin-darkened land, nearly halfway across the world from Washington, Denver, or Los Angeles. At the close of the worship hour, one of the Filipino men, while shaking hands with Roy at the door, said, "Pastor Cottrell, last night a baby was born to Brother and Sister Rhoda. They live out in the country, but they have sent word inviting you and Sister Cottrell to come and christen their little son." At first, Roy was inclined to refuse, thinking to tell the messenger that the Seventh-day Adventist Church did not believe in infant baptism or christening. But after a moment's hesitation, he replied, "Certainly, we'll be happy to go and dedicate the little lad." At the appointed time, a group of believers joined Roy and Murty for the long walk through the coconut groves. Frequently one of the large nuts would come crashing down through the foliage, and various members of the party would exclaim, "My, I'm glad that didn't fall on my head." The Rodas lived in a typical Filipino country home. It was constructed of bamboo lath, was about 16 feet square, and was built upon posts at about 6 feet above the ground. There were no chairs, and the guests who came to the christening occupied every available foot of the floor space. As individuals climbed the ladder to enter the door, the little house on stilts rocked to and fro. It was a bit frightening, but fortunately, the house stood the strains without disaster. The tiny baby, less than a day old, was neatly dressed. He even wore tiny woolen mittens, procured from somewhere, and that in the steaming equatorial jungle. Roy led the happy, curious group in a songfest of thanksgiving, then delivered a brief sermonette on the gift of a son. This was followed by a little dedication ceremony, in which the child was named Timothy. In his prayer, Roy besought the Lord to bless both parents and child, saying that the boy might grow up to be an honor to the good name with which he was christened. After this encouraging visit to the Philippines, Roy and Myrtie, in company with Elder and Mrs. W. W. Prescott and Elder J. S. James, embarked on an ocean liner for China. During the first night out of Manila, the ship encountered high winds and rough seas. Baggage slid violently from side to side of the tipping staterooms, and poor Myrtie was too seasick even to sit up in bed, as were most of the other passengers. Roy dressed hastily and hurried out on deck. There, in a sheltered nook, he found Professor Prescott quietly reading his Bible. A few seconds later, Brother James came running around the corner, his arms extending outward and water dripping from his white summer suit. It looked as though he had just taken a plunge in the ocean, clothes and all. Half out of breath, he said, "Brethren, I was just now standing on the front rail when I saw the bow of the ship plunge into a mighty wave. As it struck, the wind somehow lifted a great sheet of water. It must have been all of several tons. I saw it coming and I ran for the companionway up to the captain's bridge. But in another moment, it struck the bridge and came pouring down the companionway like a Niagara. I tell you, I held on for dear life, or I would have been swept away." They looked at him speechless. It was one of those things people hear of, but never see. By that time, Elder James was blue with the cold. His teeth chattered as he added, "I'd better make a dash for my stateroom." The sea was so rough, and so many were ill, that the dining room was almost empty. By evening, Myrtie felt slightly better. Roy helped her up to the fresh air of the deck. By lying quietly in her reclining chair and eating salty olives, she gradually overcame her nausea. The next morning, under a fair and cloudless sky, the ship dropped anchor in beautiful Hong Kong harbor. J.P. Anderson met the missionaries and conducted them to points of interest. On a terraced hillside in Happy Valley Cemetery, they stood in reverence beside the grave of Abraham LaRue. This noble consecrated man, though more than 65 years of age, worked his way on a cargo ship. From 1888 to 1902, he labored all alone as a self-supporting literature evangelist, carrying on his missionary activities with Hong Kong as headquarters. His life work was fruitful and far-reaching. With bowed heads, this little group paid heartfelt tribute to a saintly pioneer of rare devotion and reconsecrated their lives to a great unfinished task. After a short, yet very interesting institute with the South China workers in the nearby city of Canton, the party sailed for Shanghai in order to arrive in time for the annual Asiatic Division Committee meeting. The end of Chapter 17 of Pioneers Together.